The next element that we'll be discussing is education, and Dr. Jay Siegel will be presenting this. He's a recently retired Director of Forensics and Investigative Sciences at the School of Science, IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis, and Chair of the Chemistry and Chemical Biology Department, and he's also an Emeritus Professor at Michigan State University. Jay?
Good morning. I want to thank Bob and Marilyn and Max for inviting me to this plenary session. This is my first one in 35 years, and I've decided it's because I've retired. I'm not going to be around that much longer that they've decided to have me here. I had thought when I knew that my friend Max wasn't going to be able to make it today that I would deliver my talk to this empty chair, but that's been tried recently and it didn't work very well, so I decided to give it to the audience. First, my disclaimer before we go any further in this talk, and that is that the opinions being expressed today during my talk are my opinions, and they are not the opinions of others who have different opinions. I thought I would subject you to some professor speak, since that's what this talk is all about, education. I'm very comfortable talking to this audience. It reminds me of a classroom. The room is backloaded. There are a few people sitting up front. They're worried about being called upon. I can't see very well because of these lights, so you can rest your fears. In any case, I'm going to talk about education today. I've been involved in forensic science education since 1977. And let me take you back to what I call the history of education a little bit. In the early years, when I first started teaching forensic science, I started the forensic science program at Metropolitan State College in Denver, Colorado, which has now recently become Metropolitan State University. I spent 3 years there, and then I moved on to Michigan State University, where I spent 25 years and retired, and then went down to Indianapolis and started a program in forensic and investigative sciences there. One of the things that I did when I first started in education, especially at Michigan State, I remember doing this quite formally, was to sit down and meet with the laboratory directors of the local crime laboratories, in this case the Michigan State Police and Detroit Police Department. And I asked them, since they were going to be in effect our customers or clients, what they were looking for in forensic science education. What did they want our students to be prepared to have? And then back in those days, this is before ASCLD, the FBI used to invite crime lab directors every year to Quantico to have meetings, and occasionally they would invite educators. And I remember going there with Pete DeForest and a few of the other gang and talking to the lab directors. And I, again, took the opportunity to find out what it is that they're actually looking for in forensic science education. What do they want their students to have? And what I got from them in those days was just teach them the science. Don't train them. Don't teach them how to do the analysis of fibers or of blood or something like that, because we're going to have to unlearn them when they get to the laboratory. Just teach the science. And so I developed a forensic science program. I took over from Ralph Turner, who had started that program and ran it for 37 years, and I took over for him. I injected a lot of more science into the program and just taught science and forensic science. And that was fine until what we call the middle years. In the middle years, backlogs started to happen. Forensic science got really popular, and the backlogs started to accrue. And the crime lab directors were having difficulties, and still are having difficulties, manage all these backlogs. Forensic science was starting to get loved to death. And so then when I would talk to the laboratory directors about how things were going and what do you need, they said, train them. Teach them how to do this stuff so we don't have to spend so much time when they get to the laboratory. So teach them the science, they got to be scientists, but train them. Well, we didn't do very much of that. I still believed in the original concept that if I train a student in a particular way to analyze drugs, which was one of my specialties, and they go to a laboratory and they have a different way of teaching them how to analyze drugs, because as you know, there's little standardization in forensic science, and that's a problem, then they would have to unlearn them. and the students would have to unlearn the ways they were analyzing drugs and learn them a different way. So I never really subscribed to that, as sympathetic as I am to the backlog issue. I think the solution to that is hire more of my students, and the backlogs will eventually go away. Today, the reality is that we still have the backlogs. They're worse than ever, some areas. But also forensic science education has changed. And I'll talk about why that's happened. It's pretty simple, but more and more demands now are being put on education, and we just can't get into training, and that is the fact. So, what does the modern forensic scientist need to know? And again, this is my opinions. First of all, in respect to training, not education, they need to know something about crime scene investigation. And I don't care if a forensic scientist, one of my students, never goes to a crime scene. They need to know how evidence is collected so they can stop bitching about the kind of evidence that they've been getting in the laboratory. They need to know something, walk a mile in their shoes. I used to do some crime scene investigation when I was doing fire residue analysis. That's really messy stuff. So they need to know something about it. They need to know, of course, how evidence is handled. How did this thing get on my desk? They need to know now about case management systems, and they're all computerized now, and many of them are going to RFID chips, whatever those are. They need to know something about the chain of custody, because in my experience, if an attorney in court doesn't know anything at all about your science, they can always ask you questions about the chain of custody, and they still do. How to analyze specific types of evidence using the protocols of that laboratory. That's a training issue. How to testify in court, and by that I mean the nuts and bolts. You know, where does the jury sit? You know, which hand do you hold up when they hand you the Bible and ask you to, recite? Who do you look at? Those kinds of things are training issues. They're not education issues per se. And so all of these things that the forensic scientist must be trained to should be happening in the laboratory, to the extent the laboratory has the time to do it. And I think they should be doing all of this. So what does the modern forensic scientist need to be educated in as opposed to training? Well, number one, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody these days, and I don't care what area of forensic science you're in, is basic science. You need to be a scientist first. If you're not a good scientist, you're not going to be of much help to this field, because we need good scientists. So this is a litany of some of the sciences. This is not an exhaustive list, but of the sciences that we teach in our forensic science education programs. These are, the major sciences, and I would note or underline statistics here because it's becoming more and more and more important in forensic science. The use of statistics and chemometrics and the like. So basic science, very important. But in addition, how science works. How do we prosecute science? How do we do science? This is actually fairly new to forensic science programs. We figured that if you're going to take chemistry and biology and physics and mathematics courses, the professors will teach you how to do this stuff there, and they don't. They teach you the subject matter. How do you study science? How do you learn science? You've heard about observation already. That's a huge part of it. How do we learn science? What is analysis? What do we do in analysis? What's our goal? How do we get there? How do you design protocols? How do you know when you've achieved an analysis? How do you know when you've identified something? And the forensic sciences are also unique in some ways in that they are comparative in some ways. You're comparing knowns and unknowns, see if they have a common source. I used to get criticized roundly by pure analytical, that is non-forensic, analytical chemists who say, you guys don't ever identify anything. All you're doing is comparing stuff. You're not identifying stuff. Well, part of that's true. It's becoming less and less true because our ability to identify has increased greatly. So, research. Now, in many, if not most crime laboratories, most forensic scientists don't do research. They don't have the time. The laboratory doesn't have the resources. But research is critical. As you'll hear from Dr. Salyers in a few moments, research is critical to the functioning of forensic science. And you at least should know how to do it, how it's done. If you get a graduate degree, with a thesis or a dissertation, you're going to have to learn how to do it anyway. But you should at least need to know how it is done. Reporting. How are scientific results and analyses reported? What's the best way of writing reports? I would not, by the way, look to forensic science as a particularly good example of reporting. I'm doing a research project now, discovering what forensic science laboratory reports look like, and it ain't pretty. A lot of them are certificates of analysis. I got a bag of green-brown plant material, it was marijuana. No methods, materials, procedures, results you got. No interpretation, conclusions, sources of error, nothing that would be the trappings of a good scientific report. The face of forensic science is the reports that people write, because often they don't go to court. The court sees the report and maybe not the scientist. That's the face of forensic science. And if the reports aren't science, then it's not a mystery to me why forensic science is considered to be a legitimate science, especially by granting agencies. Publication. You think, well, I work in a lab, I don't do research, I'm never going to publish anything. Maybe and maybe not. Maybe you will. So we teach our students now at least the rudiments of what publishing is. Scientific ethics. How to properly prosecute science. What happens if you've got a collaborative project? Who gets credit? How do you apportion it? And so on. How do you, again, display your findings? The scientific method. Boy, we've heard lots about the scientific method now, and everybody's rushing since the NAS report to make sure their stuff fits into the scientific method. And what I've heard over the past 4 years since that report came out is that a lot of people don't know anything at all about the scientific method. They don't know what it is, and they don't even know why it is. So we try to teach more of that. And finally, scientific proof. We try to teach students, what does it mean to prove something scientifically? Now, of course, you know that legal proof and scientific proof aren't the same thing, so you got to learn that too. More, what does the forensic scientist need to know? You can see why we have no time for training here. How is science applied to the analysis of evidence? And what are the issues and what are the problems? And there's lots of them. You know, it's what you're analyzing. You try to tell students, you know, evidence sometimes is very limited, and if you drop it on the floor and the dog eats it, that's it. You can't ask the perpetrator to go give you some more evidence. They have to get used to thinking about how you apply your science to the analysis of evidence. And then there are major forensic science issues that I think all students who want to become forensic scientists need to know something about. And I used the conclusions of the National Academy of Sciences report, mainly because I was on the committee, so I subscribed to this stuff. These are some of the major issues that have cropped up from that report and are being tackled now. The coordination and administration of forensic science, the use of terminology. You know, I have personal opinions about terms that ought to be banned, like individualized, similar to, and those kinds of things, because they have different meanings to different people, and they're not well communicated to the trier of fact. Reports, I mentioned. Bias. Bias has always been there. We're just starting to recognize it now as being a problem in forensic science. At least some people are starting to recognize it. Some people are burying their heads in the sand. But it's there, and it's going to be a big problem. The scope of it is just coming to light now that research is being done by people such as E.T.L. Dror. Research. The report was full of more research, more validation. We need to have more validated methods. We need to know more about what we're doing and what we conclude from what we're doing. That's got to be taught to the students. And of course, the forensic science education itself is an issue. And then ethics. Ethics is a big issue and becoming bigger and bigger. And I believe this academy needs to take a very close look at its code of ethics. Because we've seen lots of problems recently that seem to be coming to light since the report where ethical violations have occurred, major ethical violations. So we need to give our students a strong dose of ethics. So this is forensic science. But in addition, we need to teach our students something about the criminal justice system, if you want to call it a system. The system in which we function, in which we work. Forensic science cannot be isolated from the system in which it exists. Something about the organization of the criminal justice system, certainly something about the criminal investigation process. Again, you'd like to know where your evidence is coming from, and that's different, by the way, than crime scene investigation. The whole process of how crimes are investigated and solved. They need to know something about the adjudicative process, and I mean the whole process, not just where you plug in, but the whole process that leads up to that and follows it. And then law and forensic science. Admissibility issues. You know, you are going to be the instrument of the admissibility of scientific evidence. You ought to know something about the law and how it covers admissibility. You have to know Fry. You have to know Daubert or Daubert. The whole trilogy. Kumho-Tyre, GE versus Joyner. You have to know about these cases because they affect you as scientists. And so it is the responsibility of educators to make sure that you're exposed to these things. Expert testimony, of course, and not just the nuts and bolts. What are the responsibilities of an expert that a lay witness doesn't have? What are the privileges that an expert has that a lay witness doesn't have? When you get to court, what's the rule on witnesses? What do all these things mean? And then, of course, legal ethics. Now, you're not attorneys, you're not prosecuting or defending cases, but you ought to know something about the constraints that are there on attorneys and on the court, because you're functioning as part of it. So those of us who take forensic science education seriously believe that all of this must be taught. How do you do that in a four-year education? Well, you toss out the training, that's for sure. We just can't do it. Now, in the earliest programs in forensic science, it kind of had a bad name because many programs were little more than criminal justice degrees with an internship. And I used to catch that a lot from crime lab directors who would not take our interns because they said, they're going to be useless to us. All they know is criminal justice. Well, that was not our program at Metropolitan State or at Michigan State. And it was a lot of work to get them, crime lab directors to understand what kinds of people we were turning out and to take them as interns because they could really help the laboratory. Some of the programs were basic science programs with an internship and very little, if any, forensic science education. None of the things that were on these previous slides, except for the basic science. That's a leap forward, at least. They weren't criminal justice degrees. And then things started to change. Forensic science started to be popular. It was hot. Quincy. A lot of people in this audience don't know who Quincy was. Some of you do. The OJ case stood for a lot of things, but one of the things it did was really popularize forensic science and white SUVs. CSI and the CSI effect. And people joke about the CSI effect. I know lots of prosecutors that don't joke about the CSI effect. I know defense attorneys who don't joke about that. It really crops up in a courtroom. The juries, you know, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. It really is in a courtroom. Patricia Cornwell and other authors have popularized forensic science to the point where it is loved to death. More and more evidence is coming into crime laboratories because of the CSI effect. Analyze everything. I don't care if it's got relevance or not. Analyze everything. I don't want a juror asking me why we didn't do fingerprints in this case. So, and I don't want them tossing out the case because we didn't do DNA. Never mind that the person admitted being at the crime scene and we didn't need DNA. Okay, do it anyway. So this next phase popularized forensic science is unbelievably, and so forensic science degrees started popping up like weeds after a rainstorm. Everybody wanted to cash in because all the students wanted to major in forensic science. So we had all sorts of things called forensic science degrees. They were all over the map. A lot of them still criminal justice degrees with an internship, renamed forensic science. I used to gauge the popularity of forensic science by the number of students in my introductory class, which when I started teaching at Michigan State was 80. When I left Michigan State, it was 403. And we turned away 100 because we couldn't get a bigger classroom. So I knew that forensic science was popular and increasing in popularity. I don't complain about this. I can't buy that kind of publicity, but I can get it for free. Then we started master's degrees, graduate degrees. Now we're starting to look at PhDs. But the biggest effect on forensic science education that has mandated all of this is FEPAC, the Forensic Science Education Program Accreditation Commission. It was a long time coming. I was a charter member of that commission. I'm really proud of what that commission has accomplished. Just amazing things in forensic science. It has elevated forensic science education hugely. It has put the onus on the programs to give the students a proper education to prepare them for the crime laboratory. It uses a set of educational standards developed by a TWIG, a technical working group on education. Currently accredits bachelor's and master's programs in forensic chemistry, biology, and then more recently in digital forensics. And there are about 36 programs accredited to date. You can look on the AAF website and see a separate list of accredited forensic science programs. It's made a huge difference. What's next? What's the future of education? Well, FEPAC is going to broaden its accreditations, additional areas. I think forensic anthropology is going to be an area that's going to be seeking accreditation, perhaps toxicology. So that's one thing. Online forensic science education is going to be a big player in the future. And what does that mean? Well, you can look at the future is now at the University of Florida, for example, Ian Tebbett's program, online master's programs in forensic science. How do you handle the lab part of that? It's difficult. So we got to start thinking about these things because they're coming. Online education is the wave of the future. We've got to start preparing for that. PhDs are starting to come. I talked to Sarah Kerrigan yesterday at Sam Houston State. She's starting a PhD program in forensic science, not in criminal justice, not in chemistry with a concentration, PhD in forensic science. Hopefully we will be able to do higher level research when we get PhD programs. But there's also been some talk about a professional doctoral degree, a doctor of forensic science. More like a medical degree, a clinical degree, not a research degree, at least not a major component. But courses in science, forensic science, management, budget, personnel, human resources, the kinds of things you need to be a manager in forensic science that a lot of people don't get. And we hope in the future, improved federal investment in forensic science education. We can't do the research without supporting the students. And the amount of money that the NIJ has, which is the main funding group in forensic science education, is pitiful. They just don't get enough money. Just recently, I read that the National Science Foundation and the NIJ have signed a memorandum of agreement to start looking at ways of funding forensic science. It's been a long time coming. In my early days of doing research, I'd go to the NSF and they'd say, oh, that's a justice issue, we're not going to fund that stuff. And I'd go to the NIJ and they would say, oh, that's a science issue. You know, we're not going to fund that stuff, that's cop stuff. So now they're finally talking to each other and hopefully things will improve. Hopefully the formation of the new Forensic Science Commission that was just announced will spawn legislation that will have research funding in it. Finally, the imperatives. What must be true if we're in the future of education? Forensic science educators have to continue to stress the sciences. With all of the other things that must be taught, we are educating, not training, we are educating scientists. Scientists first. And how to do forensic science. Not just the science, but how to do it. All of those topics I talked about in prosecuting science. It's got to be paramount. At the same time, however, forensic science educators are not in an ivory tower. They better not be. They have to be cognizant of their clientele, crime laboratories. That's where our students are going for the most part. They have to keep the field up to date. Research has got to be done. Dr. Sawyers will talk about in a couple of minutes. And hey, this stuff costs money. And it costs money that isn't being spent now, so where are we going to get it? We got to have it. Where are we going to get it? So I thank you for your attendance and attention today, and I give you a little quiz to take at the end of the show. Thank you.